Hello and welcome to class 14 of History 1378. I trust everybody's doing well, keeping up with the class, reading everything, watching the lectures, checking into Blackboard regularly, getting the emails I send out on PeopleSoft and whatever else. As I say at the beginning of every class, if you have any questions, check Blackboard, check the syllabus, check Blackboard, contact the TAs probably first. You can obviously contact me, but most of the time really, I pass it on to them because they're in charge of all the technical aspects of class. If you have any questions about the content of what we're talking about, the actual history, the events, the interpretations, feel free to send those along. It might be kind of fun to open these up by actually dealing with some of your questions or comments to make it a little more interactive amid these kind of unique and somewhat weird circumstances. So I hope you're all doing well, and let us go on today with lecture 14. We're making good progress. We got through the origins of the Cold War in Europe and in Asia with the Chinese Civil War and then the Korean War, where the United States and China actually fought against each other, which is really an unknown element of Cold War history, that the United States and Chinese troops actually fought against each other in northern Korea. And when that ended, that didn't mean the Cold War ended. And at the end of the Korean War, the country remained divided. It still is today. But the Cold War, which started out as a battle for Europe, to make sure that the Soviet Union didn't move into other areas beyond those countries that were in red in the map I showed you a few weeks ago, those countries in Eastern Europe. The Cold War then kind of shifted to what we call the Third World, the underdeveloped world, places that were not yet industrialized, places that had a lot of raw materials, places where quite often the United States or other Western countries had big investments, and we'll give examples of that, which will make it pretty easy to understand. These conditions are still going on today. Today, if you look at America's role in the world, quite often the United States is deeply involved and interested in areas that have resources that are vital. I mean, especially obviously Middle East oil, it comes to mind. That's the probably easiest example. But Afghanistan, which is often portrayed as this conflict between this horrific government, the Taliban, which it actually is, but also Afghanistan has trillions of dollars worth of rare earth minerals underneath its soil. These are valuable for things like cellular phones and technologies that are kind of current, lithium, things like that you would use in cell phones and internet and non-gas cars, things like that. So when there's an area that has valuable or vital resources, but it's not an industrialized area, that's often referred to as the Third World. And that's where the Cold War got pretty hot, and for a long time, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and then it continued on for some time. I mean, one of the first confrontations of the Cold War was in Iran. We're actually going to talk about an episode there in 1953, but in 1946, right after World War II ended, the United States and the Soviet Union had occupation forces in Iran during World War II. And when the war ended, the Soviet Union did not withdraw its occupation forces. Iran is incredibly important because of its oil. And again, we'll see in a minute just how important that is and what the United States does. And so the United States actually had a confrontation with the Soviet Union in Iran, over Iran, in 1946. And the Soviet Union withdrew, just like it would do a couple of years later in Berlin, just like it had done in Greece. So again, in these early years, and this goes back to a theme we talked about last week, in these early years of the Cold War, whenever there was a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, remember, the United States has all this rhetoric about how the Soviet Union is trying to take over the world, and it is bent on global conquest, this horrific state which is going to take over everybody and deny the democracy, and the United States has to stand up for freedom. The reality is, every time there's a confrontation, the Soviet Union withdrew. You know, one of the metaphors often used in the Cold War was they were eyeball to eyeball and one side blinks. And it was the Soviet Union that blinked pretty much all the time. And it certainly did that. And that Commentary became quite common during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But years before that, many years before that, at the end of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviet Union blinked. It didn't support the rebels in Greece. It withdrew from Iran when confronted by the United States. It did not support very vigorously the Chinese communists in their civil war. And then probably the most important example would be the way that Stalin ended the blockade and withdrew his forces there without any kind of confrontation with the United States, and again reopened West Berlin to American traffic and American supplies. So in those early years then, in those particular areas, the United States had this overwhelming power and was able to use it. In the third world, though, it's a little different, and we're going to see that. Now, the United States is going to create a great deal of activity, havoc, actually, in many places in the third world. And the United States is going to do this under the kind of guidelines, the rules, as it were, of the Cold War. Now, remember, in the Cold War, the issue is always going to be communism. They're communists. That's the way you kind of cover everything in the Cold War. If the other side is communist, if you can say they're communists, they're bad, they're going to do bad things, then you can kind of justify whatever you do. So in Greece, you know, you have this really horrific government, this kind of fascist group of colonels who are, you know, killing people who are opposed to them, you know, trade unionists and socialists and communists and whatever. The United States can justify sending both military aid, weapons and things like that, and economic aid to this really reactionary, hardcore, violent government, because it says that this is a government protecting democracy and that the people who are fighting it are communists. And once you make that claim, then you can kind of do whatever you want. You know, if you can say they're communists and the people we like are fighting for freedom. So it doesn't really matter at that point. Freedom and democracy, remember when we talked about Woodrow Wilson and World War I, what did democracy mean? Make the world safer. Democracy, for Wilson, it meant things like free trade, you know, commerce, free ships so that they didn't get sunk, things like that. It's basically the same thing at the end of World War II. So for the United States, in places like Greece or Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jiechi in China, or in, you know, maintaining access to Berlin, when the United States talks about democracy, essentially what it means is that those people there are willing to allow the United States to send in investors, bankers, merchants, traders, looking for markets, looking for raw materials, looking for cheap labor. So if you're willing to open your country up to America's economic representatives, then pretty much by definition, you are a democracy. And if you oppose that government, no matter what your political ideas may be, then pretty much by America's definition, you are a communist. And it really kind of breaks down that way. And once you basically declare somebody as a communist, then you can kind of do whatever you want. It's like today saying somebody is a terrorist, or the way it's not really working much in 2020, but the way some people are trying to say, oh, it's Antifa doing this or that or whatever else. But most people aren't buying that because it's kind of like everybody knows Antifa is just kind of a bunch of scraggly people in the streets who are protesting vigorously, but they're not the ones who are out there with, you know, AK-15s or AR-15s and AK-47s and things like that. So what you call things becomes very important. And if you call somebody a communist, or if you call somebody a terrorist or something like that, you can then justify doing all kinds of stuff. And I'm going to give you some very specific and concrete examples of that, like right now, okay? So let me put up the outline, and we'll go from there, right? So at the end of class the other day, I talked about the metaphor that the ambassador to Guatemala, Patterson, made of ducks, right? You know, a duck can be out there. He can have on a sign that says, I'm a turkey, but everybody knows it's a duck. You can tell by the way it walks and quacks and all that kind of stuff, you know, looks. In the same way, Patterson said, you can say you're not a communist. You can say you're a nationalist, or you can say you're neutral, or you believe in democracy or whatever, but we can tell by the way you act that you're a communist. So communists are kind of like ducks, you know, they can't hide. So I'm going to give you some examples of the way that played out. There's a lot of stuff in the book about it, I think on these pages. I hope I have it right, that you can look at it, and you should, you better, because, you know, this is important stuff. Not only, you know, I know most people in here are concerned about, what's going to be on the test, what are we going to learn, what am I going to be responsible for? I want to pass, I want to get a good grade. But, it's also kind of cool to learn a little bit of history, kind of useful that way. So reading is really essential in that regard, all right? So I'm going to start with some examples. And the first one is Iran, which I just briefly mentioned. There was an issue, kind of a confrontation in 1946 in Iran. Well, 7 years later, in 1953, it became far more critical and confrontational. Here's Iran. At the time, it shared a border with the Soviet Union. And here's Iraq over here, which in the 1970s and 80s is going to be really important. And today is really important. In northern Iran, there was in many places in Iran, but Iran was a huge producer of oil. And in northern Iran, there were communists who were involved in politics. The Iranian parliament had a kind of a communist party in it, the Tudeh party. Don't worry about that. And the oil in Iran was controlled by Britain. Iran at the time was, I think, the second largest producer of oil behind Saudi Arabia, but that oil was owned by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC, and this stuff's all in the book. And the British got over 99% of the oil money in Iran. And I know the first time I saw that, I didn't seem real to me, and I had to check 2 or 3 other sources to make sure that it was. And in fact, it was true. So the Iranians were really unhappy with the British, role there, the British control over their oil, and they consistently were demanding a different arrangement between Britain and Iran. And by 1953, they had elected this guy here to be the prime minister. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh. And I put his picture up here because historically it's kind of useful to see these people, but also take a look at him, all right? Mossadegh he's this older guy. He's got on a gray suit and a tie. Mossadegh came from a very well-known Iranian family. He would be like a liberal. In the 1940s or 50s, you could compare him to somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, right? Now, Mossadegh, however, wanted to change the arrangement between Iran and Britain. And in particular, he and his political party and most Iranians, most of the Iranian people, wanted to nationalize the oil. Now, what does that mean? We've talked about nationalization before. It would mean that the government, the state, would take over the oil industry and control it. So it will become Iran's oil industry. Now, when you nationalize an industry, you pay whoever had it before for it, and and then it belongs to you. Well, the British were furious at that. They weren't going to give up all of that Iranian oil, which made them so much money. But the British also, in the 1940s and 50s, and this had happened in Greece also, remember, were kind of weakened by World War II. So they had to often ask the United States for help. And they did this with regard to Iran too. And so the United States then began a pressure campaign against Mossadegh, trying to get him to, stop this nationalization process. And how did the United States do this? What did the United States do? Well, in particular, they began claiming that Mossadegh was where this is going, right? They claimed that Mossadegh was a communist and that the United States and Britain were fighting for freedom. So the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is still around today, I think you all know who the CIA is, sent a group of people to Tehran, the capital of Iran, led by Kermit Roosevelt, who was the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. And they made contact with people in the Iranian military and wealthy Iranians in the business community. And they began creating a plan to get rid of Mossadegh. And they did that in 1953. They began spreading all this propaganda that Mossadegh was a communist, and then they threatened to use military force. Mossadegh was afraid that there'd be like bloodshed and people would get killed. So he stepped down and he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. And Iran's oil nationalization program was stopped. And Iran was then taken over by the Shah of Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi. And the Shah of Iran, who was there to defend freedom against the communist Mossadegh. That's the way the Americans described it. Mossadegh as a communist. The Shah will promote freedom. The Shah was a military, ran a military regime, put people in jail, repressed people, ran a kind of a police state until he was overthrown 25 years later. And we'll talk about that toward the end of the class. So in this particular case, because Iranian oil was so important, the United States claimed Mossadegh was a communist, claimed the Shah was a defender of democracy, got rid of the Mossadegh government, put the Shah in power, and thereby got rid of this group of people who were trying to nationalize oil, right? Even though it was Iranian oil. All right. A year later, something very similar happens much closer to the United States in Guatemala. Guatemala is directly south of Mexico. It's in an area called Central America, along with Honduras and El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, next to a small country called Belize. And Honduras was a very poor country, fairly big, though, as you can see, but very poor and agricultural. The biggest part of Guatemala's land was owned by an American company, the United Fruit Company, UFCO. United Fruit owned about 2/3 of Guatemala's land, but most of that was not being cultivated. It was empty, it was fallow. So the Guatemalans in the 1940s had elected a government led by a guy named Juan Arevalo, who began a process of nationalizing land. He wanted to nationalize land. And then the next president, Jacobo Arbenz, really continued that program. What Arbenz wanted to do was take land that was not being used, not land that was being cultivated, but land that was not being used from the United Fruit Company and give it to Guatemalan peasants. Right? Now, the United States has a huge problem with this. The United Fruit Company, which had so much land in Guatemala, also was really well connected in the United States government. The United Fruit Company's board of directors included John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who were brothers. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA. A guy named John McCloy, who had been a government official, really big shot in government, was on the board of directors of the United Fruit Company. All kinds of people, and this is all in the book as well, who were connected to the White House, worked for the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company's director of public relations was Edward Bernays, a name we've talked about before, right? And so Bernays and others began this campaign to get rid of Arbenz. And you can I'm sure you all can see where this is going. They began putting stories in the papers about how Arbenz was a communist and he was denying people democracy, and the communists were taking over Guatemala. And because of that, then the United States, the CIA again, went down to Guatemala and began making arrangements with Guatemalan military officials and Guatemalan businessmen. And they began a campaign to get rid of Arbenz, which they did. So because the United States did not want to cede any control of UFCO's land, the U.S. overthrew the Arbenz government, just like it overthrew the Mossadegh government. And it did so the exact same way in both of these cases, just like it did in Greece, just like it would do in so many places. Venezuela in the 1940s, the same thing happened. The United States said, these guys are communists, and they're coming after American interests. They're trying to deny our freedom. They're working with the Soviet Union. They're trying to take over these countries. They're not democratic. And so we have to protect these people. We have to protect these countries. We have to put the Shah of Iran in power in Iran, Shah Pahlavi in Guatemala. Colonel Castillo Armas was put in power. In both of these cases, the governments they put in, these governments which the United States said would protect democracy, were really brutal. But it didn't matter, because democracy meant you let the oil companies in, you let United Fruit Company in, and you stop these people who are trying to nationalize these particular industries, and you call them communists, whether they are or not, doesn't matter. You just call them that. You know, what you call things is sometimes more important than what they really are. All right. those are probably the two best examples. I have a couple others here, which are important just because, right? They're well known. Now, Cuba had always been, well, not always, but from 1898 on, Cuba had been kind of in America's control, more or less, right? The people in charge of Cuba were on good terms with American business. America had a lot of investments there. The sugar industry, tourist industry, casinos, the mafia was deeply involved in that. If you've ever seen Godfather 2, that's kind of real stuff, right? But in 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba led by Fidel Castro. And one of the things that Castro and the revolution wanted to do was to take a bunch of this land and a bunch of these industries that the Americans controlled and give them over to the Cuban people. And the United States obviously didn't want to see that. And the United States began all kinds of efforts to get rid of the Castro government, including an actual invasion in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, by de Cochinos. And this is actually a picture, which I always thought was interesting, because this is Castro at the Bay of Pigs. He was actually in the battlefield giving people, orders, sending them around, which, imagine American president actually being in the battlefield, trying to give people orders. You're not going to see that. So at the Bay of Pigs was a disaster. The American group, the American kind of military group, terrorist group, whatever you want to call it, that was put together was destroyed at the Bay of Pigs. But the United States never gave up. Still to this day hasn't given up on trying to overthrow the Cuban government, right? And then another example of this came in 1973. And I'm just dancing around chronologically here just to show you kind of how widespread this is. And like I said, I could spend several classes just talking about this particular issue of these ducks everywhere, this Cold War in the Third World. But in 1973, there was an election in Cuba, not a revolution, but an election in Cuba. And this guy, Salvador Allende, was elected president. Salvador Allende was a socialist. And one of the key industries in Chile, it still is today, is copper. Chile has a huge reservoir, not reservoir, but you know what I mean, an accumulation of copper mines all over the place. And the biggest mines in Chile were owned by American companies, Kennecott Copper and Anaconda Copper. Allende wanted to nationalize, to take over these copper companies for the Chilean people, not for these American, businessmen. And the United States obviously hated that. So, and I'm going through all these quickly, which is why you have to read it. So in 1973, the United States, just like it had done in these other places, sent people to Chile. They made connections with the military and others, and they had a coup. And on September 11th, 1973, this army group led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew Allende, and he was murdered or killed himself that day. And so that government was now free, right? The Americans said, this government is not free. They called Allende a communist. They said Pinochet was defending democracy. Pinochet and Castillo Armas and the Shah were very repressive, right-wing, bloody dictators. But for the United States, they got rid of Mossadegh and Arbenz and Allende, so they were the good guys. So this happened repeatedly, and that's important because that's where the Cold War, I think, really kind of escalated and got pretty intense after World War II. It's in places like this, not really in Europe. Now, Asia is going to continue to have these issues, and it did in China, it did in Korea, it will in Vietnam, which is going to be the biggest conflict in the entire Cold War of them all, and we'll talk about that later in some detail. All right. Now, this stuff is still going on, and there's an article here which I put up just in case. You can take a look at it. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but last year there was a coup in Bolivia. The government of Bolivia, led by a guy named Evo Morales, who the Americans called a communist, was overthrown. The U.S. said, well, he's trying to, he's not being fair in the elections, which, is obviously really ironic from the United States, right? The U.S. to basically say they're not having free and fair elections. And so the United States helped get rid of Evo Morales. But the issue, which the media later talked about, was that Bolivia has one of the biggest supplies of lithium in the world, which is really essential for cell phone batteries and things like that. So the United States and Bolivia was starting to make deals with companies from like China, especially in Germany, to sell lithium, to have them kind of get part of the lithium industry in Bolivia. So the United States didn't want to tolerate, had no, desire for that. So they helped overthrow the government in Bolivia, and they put a government in charge who, again, is really repressive and very unpopular right now. So this stuff is still going on. It's in the Middle East. It's in Afghanistan. It's all over. Whenever the United States starts talking about another country and the threat it poses and how it doesn't fight for freedom and how this country is radical or it's socialist or it's communist or it's whatever, the first thing you need to do is figure out what kind of economic issues might be there, what kind of economic interest might be there, what kind of resources that place might have. If you can figure that out, you can probably have a pretty good idea of why the United States is in charge, okay? So in those particular cases, the U.S., overtly overthrew governments that it claimed were communist. Now, for the record, Mossadegh and Arbenz and Allende were all elected president. None of them, Castro came to power through a revolution, but he was very popular keeping the revolution. But Mossadegh, Arbenz, and Allende were all elected. So the United States claimed that they were communists. In fact, they were all elected and popularly by the people of Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. The United States claimed they were communists and claimed that the other guys who were really brutal were the Democrats, the people who wanted democracy, and they overthrew those governments because resources like oil, like land, fruit company land, like copper, were really the key issue there, like lithium in Bolivia or oil in the Middle East and Iraq or rare earth minerals in Afghanistan. All right. Now, it wasn't just in places that the United States actually intervened and overthrew governments that the U.S. was involved after World War II. The U.S. also went after countries that were not even really, you couldn't even claim were communist because those countries were not on America's side. So basically, when the Cold War really kind of gets going by the late 1940s, 1950, essentially, if you are not on America's side, you're an enemy, which means that there were some countries that were nationalist or neutral, all right? Nationalist countries are countries that want to basically build up their own country, modernize their own country, develop industry, develop whatever, it could be factories, it could be tourism, whatever, in their own countries. Neutral countries were countries who said, look, we want to be neutral. We don't want to be on the Soviet Union's communist side. We don't want to be on the United States capitalist side. We want to kind of take parts of both, but we want to be neutral. We may have state industries, but we'll have private investment as well. But we don't want to be like, have to choose sides. That wasn't good enough. For the United States, if you were nationalist, if you were neutral, that meant you were the enemy. And so in places like Indonesia and Egypt, in India, the United States helped, or tried at least, to overthrow governments. In Indonesia, there was this government led by this guy, Sukarno. Sukarno was part of the left. The left had led the resistance to Japan during World War II, just like in Korea and in Vietnam, when we talk about that. The United States tried to overthrow Sukarno because he wasn't that open to American investment, to American bankers, and so on. In 1957, the U.S. tried to overthrow Sukarno. It failed. In 1965, the United States did work with Indonesians to overthrow Sukarno, and then an incredible, brutal bloodbath took place. The U.S. went to Indonesia and helped Indonesian paramilitaries and Indonesian police forces root out people they called communists, and they killed maybe 1 million people in Indonesia with American help, all right? So because Indonesia was trying to be neutral, trying to be nationalist, the U.S. got rid of that government. In Egypt in 1953, there was an overthrow there of the government. This guy, Gamal Abdel Nasser, came into power. I'm not going to talk about this much because toward the end of the semester, when we talk about the Middle East, I'll talk about Nasser more than that. Nasser wanted to develop not just Egypt, but actually create a Middle Eastern group of countries that would kind of operate on its own. The Middle East had been controlled by the West throughout the 20th century, and most of its resources, and especially oil, most valuable resource in the world, most of the oil in the Middle East was not controlled by the Middle East, but by Western companies. And in fact, in Egypt, one of the main areas of commerce was the Suez Canal, which was owned by the British and the French. So all of this oil and these routes of transport for oil were controlled by Britain, by France, by Americans and others. And in fact, in 1956, Nasser even blocked transport at Suez. He wouldn't let the British and French send their ships in to, trade and sell oil. And so an attack took place. The British and the French attacked the Suez Canal. Nasser stayed in power after that, but the United States did not, appreciate that. The United States called Sukarno and Nasser communist and tried to get rid of them. Same thing in India. Jawaharlal Nehru was a neutralist, a nationalist. Nehru, had American investment there. He talked to the Americans, but he also talked to the Soviet Union. He traveled to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union came in to India to work on development projects. So the United States called him Red Nehru, like Communist Nehru. And the way they wanted him was they decided to go after Nehru's biggest enemy. In this particular case, India's biggest enemy is Pakistan. And so the United States began to heavily support Pakistan and send them all kinds of weapons and things like that. The point here, which I'm going through really quickly, is that even in places that weren't like this, where you made these overt claims that these governments were communist, the United States had issues with them. It did not respect nationalism or neutralism. If a country was nationalist, if a country was neutral, if a country would not explicitly and overtly take America's side and be part of America's economic program, then the United States wanted to get rid of them and did everything it could to get rid of them, right? To the point where it overthrew Sukarno and did everything it could to overthrow Nasser and make life difficult for him and fund Nehru's biggest rival, Pakistan. So, that's actually a very brief and quick summary of this. There's a lot more in the book. It's really important because this stuff we're going to go back to this. Like when I talk about the Vietnam War, this is going to be a key issue as well. This idea of the Cold War moving out into the so-called third world because there were kind of economic interests. The United States is still saying that the Cold War is about democracy and freedom and how bad the communists are and how they're trying to take over the world, and the United States has to protect the free world from these horrible communists, they're evil and everything else, and promote democracy. The reality is the real issue there is always going to be economic interest. That's how you can tell what side the United States is going to take in these places. If there's an American corporation involved, like Anaconda Copper, Kennecott Copper, the United Fruit Company, a British company like the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the gangsters in Cuba, the United States is going to do everything it can to get rid of those governments, right, and protect those interests, the American interests, copper, fruit companies, oil, casinos, whatever they may be. All right. So that's, and we've talked about it for a class and a half, but it's actually a very brief overview of the early years of the Cold War and how important it is. In Europe, especially after like the Berlin blockade, the United States had controlled and contained communism in Europe. Things in Asia were far more difficult and would remain so. The United States was not able to prevent Mao Zedong and the communists from winning the Civil War in China. It fought a war in Korea, and it was beginning in the 1950s to get involved in Vietnam, a place where there would be a huge, the biggest war of that Cold War era, the most violent and bloody war of that Cold War era, kind of similar to Korea, but with a lot more attention to it as well. So all those things are happening in the early Cold War years. Okay, now, when we talk about the Cold War, I was just talking about it in the context of what the United States was doing abroad, what the United States is doing in Europe, in Asia, and in the third world. But that's not the only place that the Cold War is being fought, all right? And it's being fought at home, too, inside the United States. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's important, too. We've talked about it, like after World War I, when I talked about the Red Scare. And then, I've often used references about what's happening, in the United States, really in the last 20 years, especially since 9/11. You've seen these American efforts to go after Muslims or Arabs or people they call terrorists or anarchists or whatever, right? So there's also a domestic element to the Cold War, which takes place after World War II, which isn't uncommon. That's kind of par for the course. Whenever you have these conflicts abroad and people you consider enemies abroad, then you're generally going to find something like that at home. And this is also part of the national security state that we talked about a couple times ago, I think, because that national security state said we have to preserve security at home because it's a scary world. There's threats all over the place. There are people out there all over the place coming to get you, right? And not only are they in the Soviet Union, and not only are they in China, or not only are they in Guatemala, or Iran, or in Chile, or in Indonesia, wherever, right? They're here as well. They're in the United States as well. And that becomes a big element too, because that way, if you continue to keep the Americans on edge, there are threats here at home. You need to be afraid, and you need to let us protect you. That's kind of the deal, right? There are these threats at home. We'll promise to take care of you, but in return, you're going to have to kind of give up some of the way you live to some degree, which means you're going to have to kind of give up your liberty and your freedom to some degree, which is what conservative critics of the national security state, Republican critics of the national security state, said that you're choosing security over liberty, that you're going to develop a garrison state, a fortress state, and you will deny people their civil liberties in the interest of preserving security, all right? And if you follow the news in 2020, there are a lot of examples very similar to that. So domestic containment after World War II, what's that mean? Immediately after the war ended, the American government, and this is both Democrats and Republicans, and in cases like this, generally the parties are pretty much on the same side. When it comes to issues like the Cold War and overthrowing these governments, very little difference between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. Both of them, liberals are actually very interventionist. In Vietnam, later, as the Vietnam War turned bad, then you had liberals turn against it. But for the most part, when the United States is involved in kind of declaring some government a threat and trying to get rid of it, both parties are going to be part of it. And even today in 2020, if you look at places like Bolivia or Venezuela or Iran, there's really no difference between Democrats and Republicans, between Trump and Biden, between conservatives and liberals. They're pretty much feel the same way. No one's going to kind of speak out and say, hey, you can't do that to these places. There are issues of sovereignty and self-determination, and it's not the United States' right to go in and overthrow these governments. You're not going to hear that very often, and you're really not going to hear that from mainstream Democrats or Republicans. They're kind of on the same side on this. And when it comes to these alleged threats at home, it's going to be pretty much the same too. So in the immediate aftermath of World War II, what you had was another Red Scare, this idea that there were communists inside the United States causing problems. Now, the US government doesn't want the American people questioning what it does. Now, that means it doesn't want it questioning what it does abroad. There were actually people after World War II who were saying, hey, the Soviet Union was our ally during World War II. We were on the same side against Germany. They did a lot to defeat the Germans, really. They took the war to Germany, right? Now, we have nuclear weapons. They're going to have nuclear weapons soon, or after 1949, they have nuclear weapons. Maybe it would be better if the US and Soviet Union got together and worked things out, that they weren't enemies, that they tried to be on the same side and have kind of a peaceful world, right? That was considered a dangerous idea. If you said, the US and Soviet Union should try to get along and have a peaceful world, then you might be a communist, for saying that. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, this first Red Scare began with politicians saying that, there were communists in America. And if you did not believe in the government story of the Cold War, that the Soviet Union was trying to take over the world and we had to do everything we could to stop them, spend whatever we could to stop them, then you were probably, dangerous yourself. You were subversive and maybe even a communist yourself. So as early as 1946, just a year after the war ended, you started to see Harry Truman, a Democratic president, institute loyalty oaths. So if you took a job, before you could have the job, you would have to take an oath, say, I'm loyal to the United States of America, I'm not a communist, right? Which is kind of funny, right? Because there were a lot of people who believed in freedom and liberty, kind of, like strict First Amendment type people who refused to take that loyalty oath. And they got fired. They lost their jobs and they ended up on, kind of government lists, right? Now, what's the irony there? If you really were a communist, or a radical, and you wanted to overthrow the United States, and they said, would you take an oath? Of course you would, because you're trying to overthrow the United States. So the only people who refused to take the oath and got in trouble were people who just believed in the First Amendment, and free speech and liberty and stuff like that. So it's kind of, it's a domestic political ploy at first. It's not really because the United States is under threat at home. There are some communists in the United States, not many. The United States by 1950 had a population of 150 million, all right? So the idea that there are communists in the U.S. who are going to overthrow the government is insane. It's laughable, right? And they know that. The people in charge of the U.S. government know that. But what they want to do is make sure that people don't cause problems in other areas. And we'll get to that in a second, because what the Cold War comes to mean, just like abroad when the U.S. government said, well, these governments are nationalists or neutralists, but we're going to call them communists, and we're going to say they're threats. Well, in the United States, at home, there are going to be groups who want to create a different or a bigger version of democracy. And so the United States is afraid of democracy, of expanding democracy. And those groups will include African Americans, labor unions, women, people in Hollywood. And so rather than say, we don't want to create the kind of democracy you want, to give African Americans all these civil rights and liberties and equality, and we don't want women to, have these ideas about being equal, and we don't want labor to get too, kind of aggravated and try to go on strike and things like that. Well, you can't really say that. So instead, what do you say? Well, they're communists, right? There's communists in the United States, and we have to do something about it, right? So that's kind of the background for the Cold War at home, and we're going to talk about that now, okay? And this is important, all right? There's another Red Scare, and for the most part, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, we often refer to this period, it's described by the phrase McCarthyism, or the idea of McCarthyism. This is Joseph McCarthy, who was a senator from Wisconsin. McCarthy, he's a symbol of McCarthyism. I mean, he's a symbol of this Cold War at home. There's more to it than him. In fact, even before McCarthy started his hijinks, which I'll talk about in a minute, a lot of people, including Richard Nixon, who would later become president, were already playing this. In 1946 and 1948, Richard Nixon ran first for the House of Representatives in California and then for the Senate. And both times he accused the people he was running against, liberal Democrats, of being either communists or pinkos. If you ever heard somebody called a pinko, that means that they're kind of communist light. Communists are reds, so if you're not a full-on red, if you're not a full-on communist, you're close to it, you're pink, all right? So Nixon did that even before McCarthy. But in 1950, McCarthy's a senator from Wisconsin. McCarthy's a nut. He claimed that he was a tail gunner. Joe was his nickname. He claimed that he was this fighter pilot in World War II. He shot down all these enemy aircraft. He made it all up. He was an alcoholic. He was a morphine addict. Really messed up guy. And he was giving a talk in 1950 in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he holds up a piece of paper, kind of like this. And he says, on this piece of paper, I have the names of 250 Americans who work in the Department of State, work for the U.S. government, and they are communists. And afterward, people, reporters and others said, well, who are they? And he said, well, I can't show you the names, right? And then a couple of weeks later, he was giving another talk, and he did the same thing. And this time it was like 148 names. And then a few weeks later, it was 45 names. And it kept changing, but he would never show anybody, the list, and instead of just saying, look, this guy's nuts, he's drunk, the media kind of played it up. And that was because it wasn't just about McCarthy. McCarthy was part of something much bigger. So to call it McCarthyism really isn't accurate. McCarthy's one part of it, and he's kind of the most public part because he's a spectacle. It's good theater, right? It's it's like, oh, there's McCarthy again. He says all kinds of outlandish, crazy stuff and makes all kinds of outlandish, crazy claims and comments. And, he's very adversarial. And I think you know where I'm going with this. So, but it's way bigger than that, right? Much of this McCarthyism and the whole kind of idea that there are communists in the U.S. came out of the Chinese Civil War, which I mentioned earlier. Remember, I said that everyone in the United States who was an expert on China knew that the communists were going to win that civil war. When Mao Zedong spoke, no dog barked. Yet the United States continued to support Zhang Jieshi, and they lost. When the war ended, conservatives said, well, the only reason Zhang Jieshi lost, it wasn't because he was so unpopular. It wasn't because the Chinese communists represented the Chinese people more and better. It was because inside the United States, all of these people criticized Zhang Jieshi, and Harry Truman refused to support the Chinese, which is ludicrous. The United States government sent billions of dollars to the Chinese of the Kuomintang between the late 1930s and the late 1940s. Didn't matter. When the communists won the Civil War in China, then inside the United States, conservatives and people in the media blamed Harry Truman. It was Truman and the Democrats who lost China. The implication there being that they owned it to begin with, but it was completely wrong. I mean, the Chinese didn't become a communist country because the United States did not support the Kuomintang, not at all. I mean, it was just the Mao Zedong was more popular, better organized. The communists represented the Chinese people far more than the Kuomintang did, but it didn't matter. So now inside the United States, you have to be careful, because now you can be accused of being a communist. And this is particularly important for labor unions. During World War II, and this is kind of like World War I, workers essentially made a deal that they would work hard, work as many shifts as possible, not go on strike, not cause problems, not demand pay increases, but then they'd be taken care of later, all right? By 1944, workers are starting to get kind of frustrated. They haven't been getting pay raises, there's rationing at home. So by 1944, 1945, you start to see a lot more strikes going on. By 1946, you have one of the biggest strike years in the 20th century. Because of that, Congress people, mostly Republicans, but some Democrats as well, began to go after labor. Their argument, their concern was that labor was becoming too radical. They wanted to create new unions. They were going on strike. So in 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act was the most anti-labor law of the 20th century. It kind of undid some of the stuff that had happened with the Wagner Act about 12 years earlier. The Taft-Hartley Act made it harder to organize unions. It made it easier for the government to break strikes. And it sent a clear message to unions, to workers, to labor, that if they asked for too much, then the government would say, you're communist, and go after them, right? So under this umbrella of the Cold War at home and the idea that there are communists all over, the United States government, Congress, and businesses which funded the Taft-Hartley campaign were able to impose these new laws, making it way harder for workers to organize unions, to get better wages and things like that. Now, labor did well in the Cold War because the economy grew, and we'll talk about that later. The economy grew so much. Remember, 6%, 50% of the wealth. The workers, in good industries and key industries like steel and autos and things like that were well paid. But Taft-Hartley, under the kind of justification that they were going after communists, was a way to hurt labor. All right. One of the big issues of the time also was another way that the Cold War at home was waged was by accusing people of being disloyal. Like kind of as part of the who lost China argument, people who questioned the United States were considered to be disloyal. And they even had kind of a showcase trial about that, involving these two people, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, in fact, were communists, and they, in fact, had contacts with the Soviet Union. After World War II ended, they were arrested because the U.S. government said that they had gotten information about the U.S. atomic bomb and given it to the Soviet Union. So they were accused of being spies for the Soviet Union. They had contacts with the Soviet Union. They were communists. It's still not clear whether they had any information about the bomb. If they did, it was information that the Soviet Union already had. And they really had nothing to do with the Soviet Union developing its own atomic program. However, it was perfect for the government, right? Because now you can say, look at these two people. They betrayed the United States, and they're spies. They tried to help the Soviet Union gain atomic weapons, which could have been used against the United States. In addition to that, the Rosenbergs are Jewish, which plays into all kinds of other long-standing American ideas, right? You see that today, right? When you see a lot of these groups in the streets, like at Charlottesville in 2017, it's not just that they're opposed to, Antifa or Black Lives Matter or whatever, but a lot of them also bring this Jewish issue into it as well. So the Rosenberg trial was kind of a showcase. They were on trial. They were convicted. They were both given the death penalty. They were both executed by the state. And so, again, this increases the level of fear. Oh, my God, they're like the Rosenbergs. They're just a basic couple, in the United States, and they're spying for the Soviet Union, right? So all of this stuff was part of this new idea that we are in danger. Okay, and it's under the theme that there are communists all over, but the reality is it's about people who say, hey, the Soviet Union isn't so bad, maybe we should try to have a peaceful relationship with them. It's about people saying, hey, labor needs to organize unions and it needs to get better wages. All of those issues. One of the biggest elements of this new Cold War involved African Americans and civil rights. Just as at the end of World War I, Black Americans said, okay, Woodrow Wilson said this is a war to make the world safer democracy. So we want to see that here at home. Well, the same thing happened after World War II. The United States had fought a war in which it made a big propaganda issue out of stopping the Nazis, ending the Holocaust, fighting for democracy and liberty and freedom and civil rights, taking on the Soviet Union, which the Americans claimed was trying to enslave the world. So a lot of African Americans said, okay, if you want to brag about, defeating the Nazis and stopping the Holocaust and hating on the communists, then you need to do something at home as well, right? There's a story, and I've heard it a couple times and read it, but I never actually saw it confirmed. But allegedly, during World War II, when Joe Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt met at Yalta. Remember, I mentioned Roosevelt kept saying, what are you going to do about Poland? Roosevelt wanted the communists to get out of Poland so that there could be a pro-American government there. And Roosevelt kept saying, what about Poland? What are you going to do about Poland? And finally, Stalin looked at him and said, what about Mississippi? Meaning, you really have no right to give us a hard time about what we do in Poland when in the United States, especially in the South, you still have race relations that aren't really any different than they were in the 19th century, right? And so this issue then is really profound. Okay, the United States has this horrible race relations. It's an apartheid system. We got to do something about it. The United States, however, says, well, okay, you're right. We got to do something about it, but we can't let you go too far. So the way to go about that is to go after African Americans who are talking about equal rights at home and calling them communists, right? Kind of a long-winded point, but it's an easy one to understand, right? And I'm going to just give you some examples of that. One of the best known, and this is somebody who really should be known by everybody, really fascinating guy, Paul Robeson. This is him. Robeson was brilliant. Paul Robeson went to Rutgers, where he was, I think, valedictorian of his class. He was an All-American football player in 1919 and 1920. Paul Robeson spoke like 20 languages. He just picked them up. Brilliant guy. And Paul Robeson could sing. Paul Robeson had an amazing voice. I'm going to briefly play something for you in a minute. Robeson was also a pretty radical African-American leftist political activist. Robeson visited the Soviet Union. He visited China after the Chinese Revolution. He spoke Chinese and Russian. And Robeson was not, kind of a reformist. He did not want to go slow. Robeson said American blacks needed immediate equality with whites, right? And he even said in 1948, he said, you know what, if the United States government doesn't treat African Americans with respect and with equality and give us equal rights, then the next time the United States goes to war, Black Americans should refuse to fight for the United States. Why should we fight for a country that doesn't treat us with any kind of equality or respect here at home? You can imagine that the stuff hit the fan, and Robeson was immediately attacked for that statement and for his political activism. So much so that a congressional committee called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, there's a committee set up in Congress to decide what's American and what's not. Yeah, you're an American, but no, you're un-American. You said this, so yeah, you're okay. You said that, you're a communist, right? So Paul Robeson was dragged before this committee. I'm not going to play it; it's long, but
now
this is something you really should
Mr. Robeson,
because Robeson is brilliant. He's a brilliant guy. He went to Columbia, became a lawyer. He became one of the best-known entertainers in America in the 1930s and 40s. I think he sold more records than pretty much anybody, except for maybe Frank Sinatra. He was making, by that time, he was making $300,000, $400,000, maybe $500,000 a year. Really wealthy. He was in Broadway. He was in movies. Really famous guy. His most famous role in the movies was in Showboat, where he very famous song where he sang. I'll just play a minute of it.
Ask old River what he thinks. He knows all about them boys. He knows all about everything. There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man that I'd like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old Man River, that old man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along. He don't plant potatoes. He don't plant cotton. Them that plants them, he soon forgotten. But old man River, he just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that pot, lift that bale, you get a little drunk and your land's in jail. I get weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living and scared of dying. But old man River, he just keeps rolling along.
Robeson was one of the not just biggest entertainers, but one of the most important political figures in America. And he used his music as a way of kind of getting political messages across. And that song, which is really famous, for instance, he as he got older, he would change the lyrics. So at one point where the song goes, it's really a racist song and a very racist showboat, where he says, you get a little drunk and you lands in jail. Robeson later changed that you show a little grit and you lands in jail, meaning if you speak out, if you stand up to the police, then they'll throw you in jail, right? They'll say you're drunk, but the reality is if you mouth off to them or you're being black, and so the police will go after you. At the end where he says, I'm sick of living and scared of dying, he changes that, I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And this also speaks to that issue of cultural resistance, which we talked about with regard to, say, Woody Guthrie. And we'll talk about later, especially when we get into the 1960s and the political music of the day. And then, from that point on, you have things like punk in the 1970s, rap in the 1980s to today. And you have all kinds of, music and political movements are often intertwined, and Robeson was part of that, right? So what they did to Paul Robeson was they took his passport away from him. The government called him a communist. Theaters and movie producers quit hiring him. By 1951, this guy, who was one of the most famous entertainers in America, he was a Broadway star. He sold tons of records. He made a lot of money. By the 1950s, the government had destroyed his career. He's making a few $1,000s a year at most. He wasn't able to leave the country because the government, to this day, I think, Robeson had his passport. He's a U.S. citizen who they took his passport away, so he couldn't travel abroad. I think he had his passport, kept from him for like 8 years. I think to this day, it's still the longest anyone's lost, had that taken away. So the U.S. government ruined this guy. Now, other African Americans wanted civil rights too, but they didn't go about it the way Robeson did. They were very kind of moderate about it, and they said, they went out of their way, like in World War One, to show that they weren't threatening. So they wanted equality, but they weren't going to, be, radical about it, right? Like Robeson was. Another person who was an example of that was W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, like Robeson's brilliant. He was the first African American to get, I think, a PhD from Harvard. He was a brilliant author, a sociologist. He wrote some books that are still really widely regarded today. Wrote books on Reconstruction and the souls of Black folks. And he was also pretty radical. He helped actually found the American Civil Liberties Union and the NAACP in the 1910s. But he increasingly became more and more radical and actually became a communist. It got to the point, to show you kind of the differences in the Black community. Not everybody in a particular political community thinks the same way. So Du Bois, who was a founder of the NAACP, was actually kicked out of the NAACP by the other people in the NAACP because he'd become too radical. He had become an advocate of socialism and of communism. I'm not going to play it. It's 34 minutes, but you really need to listen to this to get some sense of what I mean. And so Du Bois, the government made it hard on him, and his own people, like with Robeson, when Robeson testified before Congress, the government then brought in somebody else to testify in a very different way than Paul Robeson. Maybe the only African American in 1949 more famous than Paul Robeson. The government brought in, if you're a baseball fan, you'll definitely know this name. The government brought in Jackie Robinson. Now, Jackie Robinson was very proud and pretty outspoken. But they brought Jackie Robinson in to say, oh no, Robeson is too far out. Black people don't we don't really believe the things he does, especially when he said, if there's a war, we're not going to fight. So the government brought in Jackie Robinson to denounce Robeson. They removed his passport. They destroyed his career. They made life difficult for Du Bois. The NAACP made life difficult for Du Bois. Du Bois left and spent his last years in Ghana, in Africa. Right. So again, this is domestic containment. And in these cases, what the U.S. said is these people are communist. What they were, Du Bois did advocate. I don't think he was a member of the Communist Party, but the reality was Du Bois and Robeson and others, including Martin Luther King, were called communists. There was a labor leader named Harry Haywood. This is Martin Luther King. This is his lawyer, Stanley Levinson, who was in the 1930s a Communist Party member. So in all of these cases, the real issue for Robeson, for Du Bois, for Haywood, for Martin Luther King, and for many others, and this goes all the way through the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, was that their issue was civil rights, equality for African Americans in the United States. However, the United States, which understood it had to do something about that, but didn't want to go too far. So the United States, instead of saying, well, we're not going to give Black civil rights, didn't want to come right out and say it. It's not 2020 where you kind of come out and say that. So in those days, what they did is say, well, these guys are communists. So that issue that we've already seen abroad with Arbenz and with Mossadegh and with all kinds of people, Allende and Sukarno and others, was at play in the United States also. It occurred with labor, all these labor unions are communist. It occurred with African Americans, all these African Americans are communists. And that's a way to prevent them from creating a different and bigger version of democracy at home, a version of democracy that would have more rights for labor, more rights for unions, more rights for African Americans. All right, and then there's one more group I'll talk about, and then we'll break for this. It's women. Now it's not quite the same. Women were not as politically active, say, as labor unions or African Americans were, but the issue here was that during World War II, 16 million Americans were in uniform. They were in the military, and obviously most of them are men. So women, for the first time, began to work in jobs where they were never able to work before, especially in factories. You've probably all seen the famous, I should have had it up here, the image of Rosie the Riveter. So a lot of women went to factories and began working where they were paid way more than they'd ever been paid before. And they were kind of given a level of independence that they never had before. But when the war ended, these women were expected now to quit those jobs so that men could get them and they go back home. And this is also when the baby boom began. When you hear, okay, boomer, right? The baby boom kind of begins right and immediately after World War II, like around 1946, and it goes through, around 1960 or so. So women were expected to go back home and quit working in the factories and, have kids and be part of, the American dream, right? You have kids, you get married, you have kids, you have a house and all that kind of stuff. Women, and this has always been the case in U.S. history, women were considered to be like the moral guardians of the United States. If anybody was going to stop communism from coming to the United States, right? And the idea that America was going to become communist is insane, but this is what they were doing to scare people. So the first line of defense would be women, because women run the home, right? And it was going to be up to women to make sure that their husband didn't join the Communist Party or that their kids didn't hang out with communist friends and that they didn't, take summer vacations in the Soviet Union or anything like that, right? And so women were given this message. You have to be, good wives, good mothers, take care of your husbands, make sure they stay out of trouble, take care of your children, raise them in a good patriotic way, right? And this is an example. This is from a textbook for high school girls in the 1950s, right? And look at the lessons. Have dinner ready, touch up your makeup, clean the house before your husband gets home, take care of the children, make sure they're clean, keep the house quiet, don't complain. If he's late for dinner, count this as mine, or his problems are worse than yours. Make him comfortable. Let him talk. There's another one. This is a different one. There's another one that says, if he doesn't come home at all that night, don't question him about it in the morning because he has problems and it's just none of your business anyway. So this is the message that young American women and American girls in high school were getting in the 1950s, right? Just do whatever this guy says, submit to him. It's like being on the Supreme Court justice today, right? The country will be safer that way, okay? And so this is part of it. It's not necessarily that these women they become communist, but they don't want them getting these ideas about going to work and all that kind of stuff, right? Women in the workplace are considered, kind of a threat to men. And, popular culture reflected that too. One of the best known shows at the time was Leave It to Beaver. You may have seen that. You've probably heard of it, which is, this kind of suburban household, June and Ward Cleaver. Ward goes to work. He comes home. June takes his shoes off and, gives him a drink and just does everything, right? And there's a little clip from that, if you want to see it, right? So in the 1950s, then women were part of this domestic Cold War too. Not necessarily, in the same way that Paul Robeson or labor unions were. They weren't considered a threat, but they were vital in the sense they had to be there to make sure that the country remained the way it was. The country had to be stable. The roles that had been established, men and women, blacks and whites, had to be retained. It was going to be a country where we had to retain white supremacy. We had to retain these kind of male ideas of men being in charge, right? And so that message was always sent at women in things like textbooks and advertising. Take a look at these. I'm not going to go over them, but these are ads from the 1960s, all of which show women in a submissive role, right? Serving breakfast or, whatever. Don't get caught in her web. Don't let, wear the right use the right toothpaste so you don't lose your guy, and all that kind of stuff, right? If your husband, the guy spanks his wife for using the wrong coffee and stuff like that, right? It's kind of things that you probably wouldn't see today, okay? So all of these things are part of what we call the domestic Cold War, the Cold War at home, domestic containment. The idea here is that, like abroad, that communists are going to take over these other governments. Now, they use the same rhetoric inside the United States. So Robeson's a communist, and the labor unions are full of communists. In fact, there was one major union, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which did have communists who were really good organizers. And what happened, because of government pressure, government didn't force them to do it, but because of government's rhetoric and things like the Taft-Hartley Act, the CIO and other unions got rid of their own members and their own staff members who were communists. They just fired them. Universities got rid of professors The government didn't come in and say, you have to get rid of that professor. The universities got rid of professors for being subversive or being anti-American or whatever. So essentially, if you went in there and you told the truth, if you told the truth about American history, and this is a big issue because we're hearing this right now. Trump wants this commission on U.S. history. He's attacking people who teach Black history and the 1619 Project and Native American history and things like that. He's going after people who question whether Columbus should have a holiday in his name. This is exactly what happened after World War II. So if teachers or ministers or community leaders or civic leaders or professors or whoever said something that somebody took the wrong way or found to be offensive or unpatriotic, then that person was likely to get in trouble, lose a job, get put on some kind of list where you couldn't get a job in the future. It was a really frightening time. Now, people who defend this often say, well, McCarthyism didn't really affect that many people. I mean, a few thousand people actually lost their jobs or got in trouble. The Communist Party was outlawed. And again, you may think, oh, the communists, who cares? But the Communist Party wasn't committing acts of violence. The Communist Party was outlawed because of the ideas, the words, not because of anything it was actually doing, right? So you can say, well, it was just a handful of people, but the reality is it affects kind of everybody, because you have to be careful about what you say. If you say the wrong thing, if somebody takes it the wrong way, there's a lot of people out there. They weren't called Karens back then, but it's kind of the same thing. You see somebody you don't like, somebody says something you don't like, somebody's in your neighborhood you don't want him to be, somebody says something you don't want him to say, and you can cause that person really serious problems, right? That's domestic containment. That is the Cold War at home. It is overwhelming, it's comprehensive, and it is a way to make sure that Americans don't go too far outside the lines, that they stay safe, they don't question the government, they don't challenge the government, they don't want higher wages, they don't want unions, they don't want African-American equality. Women don't want to stay in the workplace. Women understand that their role is to go, get married and have kids and live in the suburbs and all that kind of stuff, right? So the Cold War is taking place then abroad in Europe, in Asia, in China, Korea, in Guatemala, and Iran, and all those places. But it's also taking place at home, in factories, on the shop floor, in union halls, in African American groups, in the African American community, among women, in girls at home ec classes, and women who read magazines that have ads in them. So it's overwhelming and it's comprehensive, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. This is number 14. Like I said, we're probably about halfway done, maybe more than that. And keep up the reading and everything I've said a million times. Just follow through on that. Stay on top of things. Check Blackboard. If you have any questions, hit up the TAs. If you have any questions about anything we've said here in class, I'd be glad to bring that up the next time we talk about this, that kind of a virtual, some kind of thing going on, discussion or whatever. So take care. Good talking to you. Be safe, and we'll see you next time. All right. Goodbye.